So my name is Kristen Gaida. I run the London Climate Change Partnership, and that means that I sit in City Hall in the environment team at City Hall in London, and my role is a lot more outward-facing than that, though. I'm really about organizing and coordinating activity among all the different partners in London who have a responsibility for or an interest in adapting London to the impacts of climate change and getting London more resilient and more prepared for the impacts of climate change. And the activity that we do can be all around knowledge exchange activities and getting people learning from each other across different sectors. It could be commissioning research, and one of the biggest parts of what we do is about making the links between science and research and practice and policy making. And it could be actual projects and things like retrofitting buildings or creating guidance and supporting materials for people who would be helping to improve London's climate resilience. So it's really good to be here today for this session on planning for resilience. It's an interesting time, I think, and I'd love to know, are there planners here in the audience? Could we see a show of hands? Okay, cool. That's good to see. So yeah, in terms of planning for resilience, I think it was an interesting topic. At the moment, obviously, we're in what we're calling a climate emergency. We're already seeing the impacts of climate change that is already currently happening. It's not something that's really far out in the future, and we know that despite our efforts to become net zero and zero carbon, that climate change is going to continue happening for the next 40 or 50 years because of the way the climate system works. We are also in an emergency in terms of our health, our economy, our social inequalities, all of which are kind of increasing. And the planning system has, it has some hooks, and it has the ability potentially to address some of those issues. And it has a role in improving the quality of homes and our health and well-being in our communities. And there are some good examples of where that's happening and where good things are being achieved, but they're almost happening, in my view, and it'd be interesting to hear what the other panelists say, despite the systemic failure, the sort of demoralization within the planning sector, with an emphasis on building to speed, building to numbers, and permitted development, which is leading to really terrible outcomes for public health and well-being, and just bad design in the floodplain, for example. So I have a challenge basically to this audience to think about, what can we do on the back of the climate emergency, for example? Does the climate emergency potentially help us to move forward in terms of resilience? Can we actually help make climate change and climate resilience a bit more central to what we're doing through the climate emergency? How do we ensure that planning for the climate emergency incorporates resilience as well as thinking about net zero? How do we recognize and scale up good practice that's happening in pockets all around the country? What can we expect from the government's upcoming white paper on planning? Is it that you can't hear me? Is that what's going on? Sorry about that. And what can we do if government in its upcoming white paper ignores, the need to deliver better public health outcomes? So we've got a really good panel of speakers today, and I'm really pleased to introduce them. We've got Ian Phillips, who's a chartered landscape architect and town planner and the deputy chair of the South Downs National Park Authority. We've got Alistair Mant, who is head of business transformation at the UK Green Building Council, where he leads on circular economy, climate resilience, and biodiversity. We've got Ian Boyd, who is the founder and director of art consultancy and the eco-design company Art Ecology. Have I got that right? And he's a keen naturalist driven to create resilient urban ecosystems where biodiversity, which includes people, is recognized and can thrive. And we have Hein Molenkamp, the managing director of the Water Alliance in the Netherlands, which is a leading water technology cluster driving innovation in the sector. So I would first of all just welcome Ian Phillips to the stage, and each speaker will have about 10 minutes, and what we'll do is we'll hold questions until the end, until all of the speakers have had a chance to contribute, and then hopefully bring you guys in for a good, robust discussion. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Kristen. Why don't we sit down there? Good afternoon, everybody. like Kristen said, I'm Ian Phillips. I'm a landscape architect and a planner, and you may be aware that planning has had a lot of bad press over the last 10 years or so, and has been held responsible for most of the failures of British construction industry to build enough houses or to address climate change and so on. Working as I do as on the South Downs National Park Authority, I'm very conscious of the fact that we are actually the 8th largest planning authority in England, which is kind of unusual for a national park. We do actually have a large area to cover, a sub-regional area of the southeast, covering a lot of Sussex and significant part of Hampshire. And we do have a large urban population, as well as being even close, very close to an even larger urban population. So what I'm going to be covering this afternoon is how planning can be used to deliver a more sustainable development outcome, and how it can be applied not only within a national park, which perhaps makes it somewhat easier, but beyond into the wider field. So first of all, a little bit of geography, a bit of background. The South Downs National Park is the area outlined in colour. The beige area is the long, sort of shallow dip slope leading down towards the coast. There's a coastal conurbation. The park itself runs all the way from Eastbourne to Winchester along the southeast corner of England. And there's significant populations in the coastal conurbation running from Brighton all the way through to Portsmouth. The South Downs Park itself includes chalk grassland with water aquifers below, which provide water for some 3 million people, heathlands to the north, woodlands to the west, and the South Downs Way, which is that line running all the way across from east to west, which is the ridge of the Downlands. There are also about 5 significant towns within the park, noted by the black dots, and the red dots set out the significant gateways into the park on transport routes, most of which run east to west. So as you'd expect in a national park, it has beautiful landscapes. There's the heritage coast, the iconic chalk cliffs, top left, and then the scarp slope with its chalk grassland in the middle at the top, the open heathlands with a matrix of woodland further to the west and north, the farmed arable lands forming much of the weald and the dip slope of the downs, much of which is now moving from mixed arable and pastoral farming into viticulture, because the French wine growers have realised that with climate change, the chalk south-facing slopes of the downs are actually a very fertile location for growing high-quality sparkling wine, most of which gets exported to the USA and Russia because it's too expensive for the English to afford. Then there's woodlands, significant areas of woodlands to the west, including a lot of ancient woodland, and also to the west a lot of tranquil areas, which are epitomised by this picture of the night sky here. And it's the western part of the national park is actually an international dark sky reserve and was labelled as such, designated as such about 4 years ago. And it's one of the few places in England where you can actually see the Milky Way with a suitable telescope on a suitable cloudless night. So last November, we finally adopted our first local development plan, and the key to this plan was about it being landscape-led. The evolution of the plan was always very ambitious in that it had an aspiration to marry the purposes of a national park, and these purposes are basically to conserve natural beauty and cultural heritage and wildlife, and secondarily to promote the enjoyment and understanding of these qualities by the public, but with the issue of conservation taking priority if there's a conflict. So the fundamental purpose of the statutory purpose of the national park had to be embodied within its first local plan, but also combined with the both the opportunities and the practical constraints of operating a planning system to enable development to take place within that setting. So all the local plan policies have been formulated in this plan to put landscape first and then people's interaction with that. And that's very much in line with the purposes of the park. You'll see the range of policies there, all of which are quite prescriptive in terms of what they are expecting from new development to take place in the park, whether urban or rural. And the kind of developments we're dealing with can range from farm buildings, farm diversification, where farmers are looking to diversify from traditional farming into retail or tourism or viticulture and the associated buildings that are needed to service that, through to major urban areas where we're carrying out major urban regeneration in some of the towns, and I'll show you examples of that in a little while. Sorry, I missed a slide there. One of the key policies within our plan is to promote ecosystem services, and I trust most of you are familiar with the term. It's a term that is beginning to become more widely understood, not least by the farming community, who are expecting the ecosystem services that they deliver from their management of the land to be a source of revenue in the future. This is about public payments for public services. Ecosystem services are about good soil, good air, good water, making best use of the land, and recognizing the value of the natural systems, processes, and outputs that nature can provide and natural systems can provide, that are essentially our life support systems for human society. This is something that we are absolutely requiring all new development to contribute positively towards, so that whatever development takes place actually needs to make a positive impact on ecosystem services, and all new development has to provide an ecosystem service statement. This is all development from a porch on a cottage up to a new housing estate or a new industrial development. And we produced a number of technical advisory notes, which you can find on the South Downs website, one of which is aimed at householders, and for example suggests that if somebody is doing a minor extension to their house, they might want to put up a bat box, something like that, which is at least a positive contribution towards ecosystem services, through to major housing developments where we would expect to see SUD schemes, new green space land, and the effective use of land for functional purposes, including combating climate change. The land use, which is going to support ecosystem services, is effectively going to be part of green infrastructure. And here again, we're taking quite a bold approach in that we've gone beyond the park's boundaries. We have a green infrastructure framework which covers the area you can see there on the plan. Now, the area in sort of greenish colour is the outline of the national park, where we're working with our neighbouring and constituent local authorities to have a green infrastructure network that actually extends beyond the park's boundaries and include, because green infrastructure and landscape doesn't stop at political boundaries. It goes where the landscape goes. It needs to be informed by the landscape. So it follows river valleys, it follows physical characteristics of the land. And we've identified an area which includes all those authorities outside and all the land outside the park who are working together with us to develop a green infrastructure network, which we're calling People and Nature Network, because that fits in with the current trend towards nature recovery networks, which is strongly led by central government and DEFRA. We're looking for all new development to be landscape-led, and we're looking for good landscape quality and high design standards, again applying to all development, whether it be the extension on the side of an existing house or a new urban regeneration project. All of these are informed by the South Downs Integrated Landscape Character Assessment, and they're reviewed by, they need to address various aspects of landscape, because landscape is considered to be everywhere. So the use of materials, the location of buildings and access points, the orientation, all of which come into play, and it is not just about adding the flower arranging afterwards. So we've got a very clear understanding of what landscape should be about and about how that can reflect a sense of place. And moving on from that, we take a landscape-led approach to design. So it includes issues such as topography, landscape features, the context within which development takes place, historic landscape features, the water environment, biodiversity, ecosystem services, landmarks, views, so on, all of which are set out in the diagram there, which is within the local plan. We also make use of a design review panel, which includes eminent architects and landscape architects and engineers to advise on the more contentious, more interesting developments that take place in the park. So that's a brief outline of how we're taking a nature-based approach to all new development. Policy hooks that we rely on to do this, and these are the hooks that can be applied to any planning policy in any planning authority, not just national parks. First of all, there's the European Landscape Convention, which defines landscape as an area perceived by people whose character is the result of the action and interaction of natural or human factors. And the British government signed up to the European Landscape Convention as an international treaty obligation back in 2007, I think. It is now an obligation on all planning authorities to pay attention to that, although I suspect a lot of planning authorities aren't aware of that. Then there's the NPPF and the supporting NPPG, National Planning Practice Guidance, which has a number of hooks relating to design, climate change, and natural environment, and which emphasize the use of green infrastructure, landscape, green space, and so on, and the list there, all of which need to be hooked into. I'm very aware that planning authorities tend to concentrate on providing a quantity of housing. Perhaps what's more important is the quality of new housing and development. And these are the hooks on which you hang quality. It won't be any good if we're just building large quantities of tomorrow's slums or tomorrow's buildings that are not fit for purpose, particularly in view of climate change and other factors. There are other policy hooks there, DEFRA, a Green Future 25-year plan, which requires a net gain from all new development in terms of biodiversity, forestry and woodlands policy, which promotes urban tree planting, and so on. I'm running out of time, so what I would like to do is draw your attention to, this is an example of a housing estate that was actually built in the national park about 5 or 6 years ago in Petersfield. As you can see, it's a very fine example of integrating nature into residential living. And here is another example of a nature resistant approach to new housing. I'd mentioned that I spent Christmas with friends in Germany, and it was frightening to see the quality of a house that was built 40 years ago in Germany compared to the quality of housing that we're still building today in terms of the build quality, let alone the landscape quality. So what we're doing in the South Downs is we're looking at major sites such as this. This is an old ICI Syngenta site that is being redeveloped. There's a major factory and a research lab in the middle of the countryside. We've got a new housing scheme which is actually going before our planning committee next week, which is taking a very strong landscape-led, high-density new housing, but with a green infrastructure approach and making use of surroundings and taking a very strong communally managed landscape approach to the new development. And here we have in Lewis, which is one of the major towns in the national park, a semi-derelict industrial area alongside the River Ouse, which is being redeveloped. That's our design review panel looking at a model of the proposals. And again, very landscape-led urban design, not the kind of thing you normally see in a national park. So that's the area of interest. And what we have is a whole new urban area, which is very strongly urban, but also has a very strong landscape element with SUDs built in, with understory parking and flood control, close attention to landscaped areas within a highly densely developed urban environment. and a riverside setting which follows existing character and landscape and ecosystem service provision. So that's a brief scamper through what the South Downs is delivering. I would commend to you having a look at the South Downs local plan for ideas on how you might make use of some of the ideas in that and apply them to other local plan policies, or if you're on the development side of things, how you can use the planning system positively to produce high quality sustainable development. And I'd simply leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Afternoon, everybody. Hello. Still with us? Good. So I'm Alistair Mant. I'm from UK Green Building Council. I will be talking about this, our sector ambition for built environment, which is climate resilient and also enhances nature. And just at the end of Ian's talk, I think we saw some examples of new developments that will hopefully be embodying that belief. UK Green Building Council is a charity. We have over 450 members of organisations, from sort of one people-sized organisations all the way up to the big developers, contractors, architects, engineers, etc. So thousands of people within the membership. Our mission is to radically improve the sustainability of the built environment. So this is a very natural home for us in future build. And of course we have a vision, like all good organisations. So when we're talking about sustainability, these are the areas upon which we work. Started off very much on the climate change end, now we encompass everything up to social value and health and well-being. I think the issues that I'll talk about today, actually, although they're focused on climate change and nature and biodiversity, you can easily find very strong links with all of those 5 areas. And I want to talk about 2 things today. That's the ecological crisis as well as the climate crisis, and what the ambition is for the sector that we produced last year through a number of consultation exercises, and also looking at what is a little bit about policy, regulation, and also the financial markets doing on these areas, which may well be the driver to something a bit different, which of course is what we need because we're on a very dangerous trajectory. Indeed, we're on the edge of the 6th mass extinction. The last one was the dinosaurs. They probably couldn't see it coming. So we have one great advantage over them, is that we know it's coming, and actually we know who's responsible for it, and it's us. So we very much have that power in our hands to stop it. Last year, the IPBES report showed that 1 million species are at risk of extinction. And we had a new report, State of the Nature for the UK, as well at the end of last year, which found that 15% of our wildlife in the UK is at risk of extinction. And we know that the difference between 1.5 and 2 degree world is also significant, about tripling the threat to wildlife. And one of the big impacts of that, of course, is the built environment. Since 1992, globally, we have doubled the size of the built environment, and we increase in the UK to take away natural space. Think about the number of car parking spaces in front of houses, which in fact used to be gardens, even the number of sports fields, although not richly biodiverse generally, but they're all disappearing into astroturf as well. We are eating away at those habitats. And the climate crisis, it's everywhere at the moment, so I think we all know about that. But often the focus there is on the mitigation aspect, and I think what we need to talk more about and be more cognizant of is that we've already gone through that 1 degree threshold. We're already seeing issues of overheating, of flooding, and no longer is it just in other countries far away. We're seeing it now in our own country, albeit not in London yet, but certainly in other parts of England and the UK. There's clearly a very big link there with things like health and well-being, if we can't even keep people safe in their own homes. And in fact, things like heat-related deaths are expected to double by 2050. And obviously the built environment, our homes, the places that we work, are at the front line of that. So yes, we need to get to zero carbon, and UK GBC has a framework definition on net zero carbon buildings, but we also think we need to do a lot more on actually ensuring that we've got resilient buildings. And that includes not just the new build, but also all those existing buildings. And the fact that there's about 18,000 new houses set to be built every year on the floodplains is not a good start. And another thing that I learned today at an event on green finance, which I thought was quite interesting, is if we think of the trajectory that we're on, if we're at 1 degree already, we're set to be somewhere between 3 and 4 by the end of the century. If we are to bend that curve to the 45% reduction in line with Paris, we need to be reducing emissions by 7% every year, and at the moment they're still going up. That means that even between now and by the time we get to COP in Glasgow in November, we need a global reduction of 5%. It will be interesting to see if the new operating system we're in, where no one is allowed to travel and industries are shut down, what impact that might have, and whether that might be a picture of where we're needing to head to be able to fit that. So maybe there's a silver lining about the predicament. Anyway, government has got some policy in there, and we've heard about some of it. So 25-year environment plan, looking for environmental net gain. So that building on biodiversity, natural capital, and those ecosystem services that Ian spoke about. And the National Design Guide also starting to bring in looking at resilience as well. It's going to cost a lot of money to make the changes required. So it's very interesting to see things like the Green Finance Strategy, a new proposal from London Sustainable Development councillors this morning as well about a green financial model for London. And in the Green Finance Strategy, then government showing some progressive way there also. The finance markets have woken up to this. The TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, has set out a framework for how organisations should have governance over and also a strategy to both measure and mitigate that risk, both in terms of the transition risk, how do companies move to a zero carbon model, but also what are the risks on those companies in terms of the physical risks of changing climate. And with 70% of wealth in land and real estate, that means many of those underlying assets are buildings. Pension funds are now obligated for their trustees, have to look at what those risks are in terms of climate change. Banks and insurers from the Prudential Regulation Authority mean that they have to have a senior executive who is responsible, again, for looking and reporting on those risks. And the Green Finance Strategy says by 2022, listed companies in the UK will have to report in line with the TCFD recommendations. I think exactly how we focus the finance system to meet these problems is something worthy of discussion, and hopefully we can get there in the panel, and I'd be very interested to hear what people think about that as well. So we set out to create an ambition, looking at how we bring together these two crises, and is there a way to solve them with the same, through one means, essentially. So we did a lot of stakeholder engagement with our members and other stakeholders, including local authorities, governments, universities. And we came up with this, and if anybody wants a copy of the report, I've got a few copies that explains how we get there, some of the facts behind it, and also what we mean through this terminology. I think important things to point out, it's around existing and new buildings and economic infrastructure. So thinking about roads as well, for example, power generating systems, throughout their entire lifetime, being both resistant to the changing climate, those physical risks, and at the same time we need to be working to maximize those environmental net gains, biodiversity, natural capital and ecosystem services. And we hope that we can do that through prioritization of nature-based solutions. So some of those were shown very nicely in Ian's slides earlier, but things like swales and suds and green roofs, green walls, rain gardens, and not reverting back to what we know very well as an industry, which is more of the hard engineering solutions, which of course we could do in response to some of, say, the flooding and overheating that we're seeing. So if you look in the report, you can see that we've gone through and we explain word by word, and this is all through consultation as to what that means, why we've come up with that phrase. And I see it as a flag in the sand that we want to aim for by 2030. There's a lot there to unpick about what it actually means and what is required, and that's the next stage of that process that we're on now, working with stakeholders to see the guidance that we can help create for the industry. We're not starting from a standing start, which is great. We have an action and resource map on our website, one for climate resilience, one for biodiversity. You can go on there, it's interactive, you can zoom in and out, see what all the initiatives are that are already happening around the UK and all the different stakeholders that are involved in leading those, and then click through and find further resources. One thing just to highlight, that we're on an exciting project with Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which is a great example of collaboration, which is most definitely what we need on these issues. There's 12 partners on this, working on the Ignition project, which is aiming to increase the amount of green infrastructure or nature-based solutions within the Manchester urban area by 10% by 2038, focused on solving or making the city more resilient to those climate impacts. And one thing they're doing on that is trying to come up with an innovative financial mechanism. So again, going back to that green finance piece, what is the financial mechanism we can create to attract investment to enhancing green infrastructure within urban environments? So again, you can go to there's an Ignition project webpage run by the GMCA. Go and have a look, see where we are on that journey. We're just about to start year 2. It's a 3-year program, 4 million EU funding, and hopefully we're going to create something really exciting that can then be replicated across other cities. So we're on a journey. We don't quite have the roadmap yet, but we've got an end destination we think we need to aim for as an industry, and we're really keen to work with others to try and make that happen. Thank you very much.
Speech button, is it? Just there. Thank you very much. My name's Ian Boyd and I work for ARC Biodiversity and Climate. We're just over in F148, just over there if you'd like to come and have a look afterwards and have a chat. We're most interested in a resilience conversation that combines ecological functionality with human well-being in the same place at the same time. We're talking about synthetic ecosystems in the urban environment, which have multiple benefits. And because we work not only in ecological compliance, we provide those services to the industry, but also do place-based regeneration work for local authorities. Perhaps it's taken us too long to think this way, but we do now absolutely think about the development work that we assist with and that we contribute to as all about habitats for humans. That's precisely what it's about. We work a lot with local biological records associations and organisations. So the Isle of Wight has 7,000 species. Actually, it doesn't. It has 7,001 because we miss ourselves out of that every single time. We are, broadly speaking, medium-sized social mammals, but we're exceptionally bad at building habitats for ourselves. We do it extraordinarily badly, and that's often because the design approach that is taken, not always and not only volume house building, misses out people. It's not that interested in the quality of life of the inhabitant. It's interested in the efficacy of getting through the planning process as quickly as possible. But the quality of life is a fundamental resilience conversation. If we're building places that make people ill, and we are, what possible hope do we have for a resilient future? If it's just hard enough to get through your day and the place you live makes it harder, how can we possibly expect to help individuals and communities have resilient responses to socio-economic shock and climate challenge ahead. It's simply impossible. We have to think about the functionality of the places that we live as habitats for humans and integrate an ecological approach to this alongside our built and planning approach. And we can plan for this. This is taken from, I think it's called the Place Alliance, their audit this year of the housing stock of the UK. And it is absolutely shocking. So their response to this, their conclusion was the majority, not just a bit, but most of housing that is built is poor quality. That is just unbelievable. It's just extraordinary. Now, I don't know where that is. It's from their report, however. I'm not trying to demonize this place, but this is just a perfect example of how we build places in order to maintain them. You just know that that place is built for efficiency of maintenance and nothing to do with quality of life at all. All it wants to hear is the sound of mowers every 2 weeks. It's not interested in birdsong. So we are building places to maintain, and we're missing out life in between entirely. It's absolutely insane. And we're just storing up problems and issues. We're making it harder and harder and harder to respond to the challenges that are coming our way in the environments that we create for ourselves. It makes no sense at all. Instead of which, we just need to find an ecological approach that provides healthy places where we can thrive and as a community come up with the sort of responses we are going to have to negotiate and at the same time make room for the natural world. It is a holistic ecological approach to the built environment for people and wildlife at the same time. It sounds fanciful, it simply isn't. Using ecological leverage to make better places for people is a planning tool for resilience, and we're not using it. And the reason we're not using it is that there are no public health tools. In the 1970s, so 50 years ago, there was a discipline called human ecology. It existed. There were people like Lewis Mumford. There were people like Forrest Stearns, a heroic urban ecologist from the States. All you need to know is in that single paragraph, it is simply perfect because it describes designing habitats for human beings. And if we follow that list of instructions in an imaginative and creative way, we would be building the places that we are not building now. And the Place Alliance audit would not say the things it has said, because we've forgotten. Somehow human ecology as a discipline has evaporated entirely. It doesn't exist. We have to have it back. We knew how to do it, we forgot how to do it. So this is not rocket science, it is not complicated, it is simple, it is straightforward. We just need to get on and do it. Now, our approach to that is to think about building features that are useful for wildlife, so they have an ecological function that is useful in terms of mitigation, enhancement, net gain, all of the policy drivers we are talking about, but they have a public realm function, they have a decorative function, they have an aesthetic appeal. How can we incorporate ecological value into the built places where people live in such a way that it improves the lives of people too? Now, of course, you have to be careful. We can't drag wildlife into an ecological sink and destroy it with cats, which is a risk. But we are sophisticated mammals. We can do this. We can design ways of bringing wildlife into the human domain that is good for wildlife because it's good for people. They are not exclusive missions. They are the same mission. These are simple tweaks that we have used in urban environments that encourage people to engage with the natural world in a more interesting, shared, communal public space. And it's the public spaces that are going to drive resilience as much as the individual homesteads that we build. The places where we live, the places where we work, the places where we learn. That built environment has to be good, but the space around it has to be good as well. It's not a throwaway space. It is contributory to the resilience agenda. It's crucial to the resilience agenda. Now, we are ecologists fundamentally. The leverage we have over the built domain is ecological. Wildlife policy and law terrifies developers. You say dormouse, they're horrified. You say newt, they faint. Our job, because we do not have public health tools available to us, why is that? There is such a thing as a health impact assessment. Have you ever seen one? I've never seen one. I've never encountered one, ever. But it does exist. Why do we not have the health community contributing to the debate about the design of places in planning? I've never once seen a response in that way. But we can use wildlife law to make better places for people. If we design a place that is good for dormice, that generates the best possible informal play area that you can imagine, then we're doing a good job. We're using the leverage that we have at the time that we have it. This is going to align. Human health, ecological health, environmental health will align in policy at some point. Wales already has a Future Generations Act. It's coming our way. But in the meantime, we have to use the ecological tools that we have. So using protected species to produce better places for people, that's exactly what we should be doing. Our obsession with pollinators is wonderful. That beautiful thing is Andrena labiata, a ground nesting bee that feeds on Germander speedwell. We can make that happen. We can create habitats for that. But in doing so, we have to enliven and enrich the public spaces for people, which makes more resilient places, healthier places to live. So we're talking about using ecological tools to deliver human health and well-being. We're integrating ecology and human health. And that approach fits into every part of the urban resilience debate. It fits into each part of this by using an ecological approach to the human realm that draws in the natural world. As policy drivers demand of us, we're anticipating the next resilience discussion, which is a human well-being discussion. So at every part of that chart, thinking about ecological value in the built environment delivers a better place for people. It has a carbon function too. Am I okay for time? It has a carbon function too. Just a quick example, if I may, just a couple of examples of how this can work in totality. I have worked on sites, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with, a cut and fill development on a steep slope. And we will see a developer happily spend 50,000, 100,000 on carting off material to leave a perfectly flat, abysmally boring, dismal green thing that no one wants and call it done. We see developable space sacrificed for spurious ecological gain that wildlife doesn't want, that just perpetuates urban sprawl. It's inefficient, it's expensive, it's wasteful. What if you kept all of that material on the site and built a wonderful, lumpy, informal space? You didn't call it a play area, but you know it will be the play area. It is full of hot spots, dry spots, slopes, plateaus, voids, hollows. It will be full of wildlife. And people will encounter it because they will be there. They'll be using it. Put a seat next to it. Make it something special. Now, the first thing you will hear is how we're going to maintain it. I don't care. I do not care, because there will be a way of maintaining it. Can we just stop with building things to maintain them? Let's build things to enjoy them and build things that sustain our way of life and the natural world at the same time. So by thinking ecologically, we can deliver better places for people. And our approach, which is called Shaping Better Places, focuses precisely on that agenda, taking an ecological approach for the natural world and the human world at the same time in the same place. Thank you very much.
That's it. Okay, thank you. Very inspiring to hear your story. I think there is a lot of things which come together. My story is more about innovating technologies, but I think at the end of the story you will see that a lot of things come together. So that's might be why it's also interesting that we are here with those very different speakers. I'm Hein Molenkamp. I'm Managing Director of Water Alliance, which is a Dutch-based water cluster organization in the Netherlands. And my story is, in fact, two things. One is about how we deal with bringing new technologies to the market from the initial idea to the outside world, which takes most of the time a lot of years before you really bring a new technology to the market. So we are based at Water Campus in the Netherlands, and this whole ecosystem is in fact created to help accelerate new technologies and bring those to the market. And I'll end up with a few examples of companies who have developed interesting technology, which is also here at this exhibition where we have a booth. So we hope to speak to you later. Well, if you look to the Netherlands, then most of you, they see that the Netherlands is known for its innovations in water. And then many people think, of course, about the situation that we are good in building dikes. If we were good in building dikes, then probably the Netherlands would not have been there anymore, because over 2/3 of the country is below sea level. It still is. So, but by creating those secure dikes, we were able to not to fight against the sea anymore, but to live with the sea and the water. And to help you a little bit, it's not only about the sea, it's also about the water coming from the rivers from all of Europe and going, at the end, going through the Netherlands and end up in the North Sea. And still, in the Netherlands, we are able to make very healthy drinking water also from this water. That's interesting. Where I'm working for is an organization which is not dealing with dikes or with building harbors, but with the other thing we call also with water, which is about water quality. And we say this is water technology. So, well, this is a picture looking from the moon to Europe and to the Netherlands. You see there is a lot of water involved in the Netherlands. So it's not so very strange that we have coped with all those challenges with water through the ages. Water Campus, which is this ecosystem which is based up north in the town of Leeuwarden in the Netherlands, is in fact an interesting place where a lot of European cooperation comes together in creating new technologies. I'll explain with a few slides these European connections. If you look to water technology, then the interesting thing is that technology is not only developed to use in what we say the water sector, so let's say to create clean drinking water or to treat wastewater, but a lot of water technology is used in other sectors, like in food industries or like in chemical industries, like in the energy and food area. So water, in fact, is a sort of an enabling technology for many sectors in the world. If you look to what Water Campus does, it's in fact an innovation ecosystem to help accelerate new technologies going to the market. From the initial idea to the whole phase of scaling up technology and testing it and bring it to first customers and even bring it to export. The interesting thing is that if you have a bright idea and you think, well, this is really where the world is waiting for, then you think, well, it takes maybe 3, 4, 5 years, and then it's a big success. But the real thing is that at the end of the day, it takes many technologies. They take more than 10 years, and even sometimes take more than 15 years before they get really commercial interesting. And I'll show you a few examples. So. To help to overcome that, we have created this ecosystem which you see here, and I go circle by circle through these ecosystems to show how we help companies bringing those new technologies to the market. This Water Campus is in fact a sort of a system where on one hand scientific research, applied research and business come together. And a very important one is also that we take care of education of students who will be educated in the field of water technology. You see this circle, it starts with an ID, an initial ID. And at the Water Campus there is created an institute which is now there for some 15 years. What they do is they gather the knowledge of some 23 different universities from all over Europe and bring PhDs from those universities to one place which is called the Wetses Laboratory, and they work on their ID and their PhD program for about 4 years. And what they are looking for is really breakthrough type of technology. So let's look to an existing technology. What they don't do is see how can we improve an existing membrane for 3 or 4% more effectiveness. No, they look for a real breakthrough type of new technologies, which is quite challenging, of course. The interesting thing at this Retzes Institute is that this is not only done on university level, but there is also over 110 companies commercially involved, which makes sure that this research is not only fundamental, but it is also somehow market driven, because otherwise those companies would not invest in this research. But still it is a breakthrough type of technology and a very early stage technology. Once this technology is created, so let's say the idea is a proven idea, then companies who are involved in this research, they have to take care that they scale up this technology to full-scale type of applications. Therefore, at water campus level, there is also a water application center where companies can rent a spot and do their laboratory research and scale up, so-called, their technology. Of course, it's totally depending on the type of technology, but let's suppose it is a industrial wastewater application, then of course the initial research is not enough to bring it to the final stage. You need to have scale up, and scale up can be a big pilot which has to be tested in a lab, can also be a sea container type of pilot which has to be tested somewhere at the first initial customer. This is what happened here at this area. So what you see here is what we call demo sites. This is 5 to 6 different demonstration sites which can be used for testing these technologies. Well, there's not only those testing facilities, but this water campus is also the house for the what we call a business center where companies can start their initial business. At the moment, there are some 15 different startup companies having their offices at Water Campus. To be able to create new technologies is, of course, very crucial that you set up worldwide cooperation with places all over the world where we can team up with each other. And those technologies, well, in water, it's always a sort of a crossover between food or energy and water and food. That's where, in fact, all those innovations take place. These may be examples of a membrane installation, and you see a picture of a typical municipal wastewater treatment. But to go a little bit more in the details of examples of companies who are dealing also what is shown here on Future Build, these are decentral sanitation examples of 2 companies. This one is called DESA. What they did, they created a technology which can be used in a new built area where, in this case, some 230 houses are connected to one new decentral sanitation system where not only the water from the toilets is treated and biogas is harvested, which biogas can be reused as heating in the houses, but also the water from the washing machine and the shower is treated separately. And then if you do it really decentral, you can also take care of getting useful resources out of the water, like phosphates, which can be reused to use in the gardens or in the agriculture nearby. These type of systems bring it really towards a more circular economy type of scale. Another example is a Colubris, which is also exhibiting here. They have really adapted a very interesting biological wastewater treatment system, which really sometimes looks like a glass house system, which can be used in the new built areas. And then the people who live in the area, they see how plants grow, in fact, on the nutrients which live in the wastewater. And at the same time, the wastewater is treated to clean water, and plants grow on the nutrients in this water, which is really important for the awareness of the people, how important water and reuse of water is. Another example is a company who has made technology which reuses the cellulose from wastewater, which is in fact the toilet paper which goes to the sewer. If they take out this toilet paper in the sewer treatment, they reuse this cellulose after treatment for instance, constructions of roads or even in building material. So in that way you get really a sort of a circular economy. Another company has set up a system to treat rainwater and make drinking water right away out of this rainwater, which makes sure that the rainwater is not going to the sewer, but reused as soon as possible. And a very interesting last example is this company called Hydroloop. It's in fact a startup. They are only 5-6 years old, but what they developed is a small refrigerator-like equipment which can be used in houses, and it will treat the water from the shower and the washing machine, and in that way reuses more than 60% of the water which is normally wasted to sewer, but is then reused and can be, for instance, used for a toilet flush or for use in irrigation of the garden. And of course, well, like in the Netherlands where there is a lot of rain like here, then it may be not the first place to think about, but this company in January won the biggest innovation prize at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. Between all the big players of Samsung and Sony, they, as a startup, they won the biggest innovation prize, and you see there, this type of equipment will become very, very, very important in the near future, also in our area, in my impression, to give more awareness to the importance of water in our society. This was just a short introduction, so I hope that we will set up a fruitful discussion together. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll invite the speakers to come back up. Unfortunately, I think we have a little bit of trouble possibly hearing what's being said through the mics up on the stage. So if that's a problem, we'll just bring people back. So that's really great. So we've heard, I think, a good range of views and ideas about how to sort of think about the climate crisis, from, you know, how can we potentially use the planning system, to how can we come up with different types of economic and financial hooks and other types of drivers to improve biodiversity and sustainability, to thinking about, you know, kind of having a change in mindset from the natural environment being just sort of an annoyance that we need to manage, to actually bringing it in and living with it to make our own lives better. And then thinking about technological innovation in terms of water sustainability and other types of things. So we've had a good range of discussion here, but we'd like to hear from you. So I think we'll take a couple of questions at a time, and then and we'll go from there. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I haven't listened to all the speakers, but I'm just interested in your views collectively. I've just been listening to a bunch of speakers from the energy stand, and a number of them are talking about the importance of solar PV systems and wind turbines. And I'm just wondering whether these technologies to try and combat climate change grates with your agenda when it comes to biodiversity.
Any other questions? I'll take that one back there. Sorry, that one.
I also have come from another set of speakers who've been talking about climate change and the built environment, and thinking about how we can change. I mean, we've seen some rather depressing pictures of housing as designed by the volume builders, and I fully kind of support the position. But their position was actually, what we've got to do is focus on the type of people. Too close to it? Is that better? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Is thinking about how we go about changing the nature of the people who decide these things. You know, like we see, you know, that volume housing was built by, I don't know, Wimpy's or somebody. It's not through, I mean, you're preaching to the converted here, because I kind of think that, you know, the images that I've seen on the screen are fabulous. But how do we preach to the unconverted? That's my question, I guess.
Great, thank you. So on the question of renewable technologies and that type of thing, and how that might or might not clash with our aims around biodiversity, any thoughts on that, Ian? Yeah.
I don't think there's any reason at all why they should conflict. It's a matter of sensible, imaginative design. I think we have sufficient urban volume, if you want to call it that. If you think about the height and breadth of the spaces that we build, and of course there will be optimal locations for these things, but I think we can design in a patchwork of useful devices to support sustainable human living if we think about it. Of course, sometimes there will be a clash and there will have to be a compromise, but I think at a basic level they are not exclusive. And I think as technology increases and the sophistication of the renewable technology increases, then those opportunities to perhaps even integrate in an interesting way may become greater, in the same way that field PV arrays can actually provide exclosure. I mean, they can nonetheless provide interesting songbird exclosures. It's a little thing. It's using up agricultural land, but I think there may be interesting crossover to come, which I don't know how to predict.
Alistair?
I know even in London there's examples of roofs with solar panels, but also living roofs on it as well. So it's generating energy and also having a positive biodiversity impact. One of the things we found through our discussions is that you probably would use a different sort of green infrastructure or nature-based solution depending on what you're ultimately trying to achieve, and not one thing solves everything. So are you trying to give access to the community, the local population, or the users of that building, or do you want to create more of a nature reserve and encourage biodiversity? Those things may not always go together, certainly if you've got a small area. The same thing as if you've perhaps put a green wall on a site, but it doesn't really have much rainfall. What are the plants you're choosing? Are you really doing it more for aesthetic, the biophilic, the health and well-being impact, but it's using a lot of water? Then, you know, you're not helping potentially other environmental concerns there. So I do think there's more education we need to do to understand what we're trying to achieve, what is possible, and then make informed decisions.
Thanks.
Before you, I see you want to come back, but I think you've raised a good point about the potential conflict between addressing new technology and issues of design sensitivity. And that's something that we're wrestling with all the time in the national park, because, as I said, one of the statutory purposes of the national park is to preserve the beauty of the park, its landscape and its cultural heritage, which includes buildings. Now, the way we interpret that is that we're not preserving some Hardy-esque image of the countryside in aspect to be sort of forever unchanged. What we're trying to do is manage change. What we've inherited in a national park is the result of 1,000 years of evolution in building and landscape, in land use. What we're trying to do now in terms of our caretaking role as a national park authority and a planning authority is to accommodate the change that is needed to meet today's changing lifestyles and today's challenges, particularly including climate change and energy efficiency, and finding ways of integrating that in ways that are well designed, acceptable and harmonious with the landscape and the character, without necessarily being copies of the past. So we promote good modern design, for example.
Great. Thank you. And did anyone want to try that second question about how do we not be preaching to the converted and change? Sorry. But how do we potentially, talk to sort of new people, or as you said, change the nature of the conversation or the people that we're talking to? Anyone have a view?
I think I did a lot of talking about technology, but it doesn't say that technology solves it all. So if I look back in my lifetime, then I think, 50 to 60 years ago, we discovered water toilets, and we flush today. We think it's normal to flush our toilet with drinking water, but if we ask our kids and our kids' kids, then think, who the hell did think about flushing a toilet with drinking water, which is a very valuable resource? So I think it's a mixture of things, and the problem with today's consumers is that they are pretty far away. If we look to the water issue, they don't see the problem. You open the tap, you have safe water. You go to the toilet and your problem is flushed away. it's far away from today's consumers. And I think what we have to learn to bring it a little bit back, that everybody understands that the awareness around that it is not that normal that everything is clean. So yeah, it also has advantages that we educate also our young children that things can also be done differently. So it's a mixture of some things will be done, will be able to change with technology, and other things have to be in a combination. Yeah?
I'm a great believer that the technology is there, that we can solve these things pretty much tomorrow if we really wanted to. So I think there's a huge cultural piece in how we change the narrative, and that comes from different parts of society. And the positive side of me says that it's definitely happening if we look at what is coming, from policymakers, and both Ians have touched on that as well. It's trying to move the dial from where we are, and some of those very poor quality examples we saw. I think you see people on the streets who are the ultimate, consumers, the people who have to buy and live in these homes, that I think our expectations as individuals are changing very rapidly, and the questions we ask will be different. Unfortunately, we tend to be perching in a very constrained market if we're looking at housing, so we need, I think, policy to drive it, and we need the narrative from government to be different, that it's not all about quantity, but there's quality. And I think there's also hope in the financial market starting to ask those questions as well, and many people building homes have shareholders, have owners of equity who want to know, what does the changing world mean for that company? What is the role that they're playing in actually mitigating those risks but making a better world? Because that's, when you look at what the younger generations are expecting, that's what they want to see. They are, the consumers, if we need to call them that, but they are the population of the future.
It's such a good question, really. How do we make a change in a highly conventional system that is churning this stuff out day after day after day? There are exceptional schemes which are held up, and they're wonderful, but everyday planning officers have substandard planning applications coming across their desk. What do we do? I think the policy drivers are changing, and the financial instruments behind these very large organizations are changing. I think there are drivers there, but I think a big change is the public discourse in planning. At the moment, it is relatively poorly informed. What at a low level, at an individual, but actually at a parish and town council level, what you can demand, the power at that level to say this is simply not good enough, take it back and come back when you've thought about the following things. But it has to be in a discourse and using a vocabulary that works for the planning officer. So I think we need to work really hard in enabling those tools to be accessible at a public level, so that the demands for better development come from a very much wider audience.
Yeah, I think you've hit an important point, and unfortunately most planning officers and planning authorities are under pressure to deliver quantity, whereas what we're talking about here is quality. I think what we've got to do, probably everybody in this audience is clued up about what good quality new building should look like, and the performance standards that we should be able to expect from technology that is mostly 30 to 40 years matured. It's not new technology anymore. Triple glazing has been around for a long time. It is rarely applied in any new British housing. Heat pumps, air pumps, and so on. Most of this technology is available, but it's not being put to use. I think what we need to do is get a message out to the house buyer, to the consumer, to the building occupier, that things really ought to be better than they are. That if they were to see the standards that new houses, or even 30-year-old houses, were being built to in most of the rest of Northern Europe, then we really shouldn't be satisfied with the standards that we're getting here. And that consumer understanding of what is fitness for purpose in terms of habitation and building envelopes and building functionality needs to be understood by more, and then translated into political action.
Thank you. Right. We can, I think we have time for a couple more. Can we take that one over there? The two in the aisle, please.
Where the South Downs has completed their rather new plan, a lot of councils are still working on very outdated plans which don't include some of the issues we've highlighted. would it be possible for the South Downs to either share their ideas, their plans, and the way to implement that with that or with central government to push things forward even further?
Today is part of that exercise. That's why I'm here.
Can we just take the second question as well?
So I resided in Lewis until quite recently, and I'm just aware that the site that was shown for development, the Phoenix Quarter, it's recently been flattened, and before there were some existing foundry buildings, ironworks, and it was also the home of quite a vibrant community of artists and craftspeople. And the role and the diversity of people going into the future, because for me that whole area was such an enormous community resource and a place of the imagination. A developer comes in, sees a profit to be made, piecemeal public consultation. It gets flattened, everyone gets moved out, and not much has happened in the 4 or 5 years since everyone's moved out. So I just kind of wonder, where is the role in community-led housing consultation? Because surely the communities and the people living in these areas kind of have a sense of what is going to serve now and in the future in terms of resilience.
Great, thank you. So on the first one, in terms of sharing good practice and planning, I mean, I would just pull another plug here for the London Climate Change Partnership, which exists to share the kind of good practice across sectors in terms of helping people to learn from each other on different issues around the built environment and infrastructure and transport and natural environment and so forth. But I would like to let others answer that question.
I'd better go on now. Well, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to speak today was to actually publicise our local plan and get it out to a broader audience, particularly a non-planning audience, a broad audience that you tend to get at Future Build. But we are pushing our policies to all our neighbouring authorities. I mentioned the Green Infrastructure Network that's going beyond the park boundaries. We actually have planning officers who are providing advice to other authorities and sort of giving them the benefit of our experience. So yes, it's something we're being very proactive in, and as you say, other local authorities are slowly but surely having to produce their local plans. I hope they will learn from our example. All we can do is get it out there and publicise it as much as possible. Today's part of that process. Can I also come back on the second question? Because yes, we were very conscious, I was personally very conscious of the creative community that used the old buildings in the North Street Quarter in Lewis, and one of the fundamental requirements of our planning permission was to ensure that provision is made for low-cost workshops and accommodation for the creative community members of Lewis. I mean, yes, development happens, and you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. And most of those buildings were fairly substandard, had outlived their usefulness, and because it was in a key area of central Lewis, it was ripe for redevelopment. Redevelopment gets done by developers, and that's what happens. But as far as possible, we have tried to ensure that the creative life of Lewis is maintained and encouraged and stimulated in the future. So I share your concerns, and I hope we try to address them.
Just really quickly coming back with that, I mean, tying in with the community-led development, there was, an alternative proposal made by the collective that had formed around kind of challenging the developer model for there. So, I mean, just
yes, and often community-led development proposals come forward, but communities tend not to have access to the billions of pounds required to actually build them, and that's the downside. Things get built by people who can afford to build them. Communities tend not to have access to development finance.
Just to share a piece of a policy instrument to answer the first question that might be useful, but perhaps you haven't heard of. The Isle of Wight, June last year, June the 19th, in fact, was designated a UNESCO World Biosphere Reserve. So that's the whole of the Isle of Wight, which is where I live and work, and the whole of the inshore waters around it. And the Man and Biosphere Programme is really, really good the UNESCO website, so it's the United Nations program, the UNESCO website for biospheres is a bit clunky, it's a bit hard to navigate, but it's full of interesting information. But look for the Man and Biosphere program. Again, it goes back to the 70s. It talks in a human ecological language. It's an interesting thing to have a look at, and you may find it useful. Just quickly on the second point, if that's okay. It's such an important point that you make, and I don't have an answer, but personally, I would, under the banner of the one public estate mantra, which local authorities are signing up to and are supposed to treat seriously, I would love to see public buildings, public estate, put to those kind of uses, even if they're meanwhile, even if they're stepping stone uses. There should be much more social enterprise driven development to support that kind of shared co-housing, creative space, affordable workspace model that is driven by local authorities, that is not just a disposal to the private sector, that is driven and authorities for that kind of public benefit. Doesn't happen enough, but it could do.
Great, thanks very much. And I think with that, we are actually just about run to the end of this session.